You've probably already heard that there is a new Beatles documentary out called Get Back, and it's available on Disney+. And long story short, it's hours and hours of previously unseen footage from the 1969 Let It Be recording sessions, cut together by the Lord of the Rings director, Peter Jackson. And it really does feel like you've been teleported back, because it's very much fly on the wall. There's no voiceover, there's no cutaways, you're just in the room with them each day, really getting a sense of time and place. And it's just an amazing insight into how the Beatles worked, how the Beatles were as people, and the entire operation around the Beatles, the often quite chaotic day-to-day existence of the Beatles. So today I'd like to run through some of my favourite moments from this, because it's, I think it's about 9 hours long, so there's plenty to talk about. But let's dive in with my first favourite moment, which is seeing how Get Back was recorded and written. In the documentary, we actually see the moment where Paul McCartney is mucking around on his bass guitar and starts humming the melody to Get Back. But of course, he hasn't written it yet. He's finding it. And you can hear him trying out different ideas, almost trying to pull it out of his subconscious. It's amazing with this cultural property, Get Back, which is so timeless now, to think that at that time it hadn't been written yet. And we're seeing the moment where we go from Get Back not existing to Get Back existing. And within about an hour in the documentary, they are now performing Get Back as a band. And, it's just amazing to see such a classic song have its genesis. We also, in the documentary, get an opportunity to hear a few Beatles songs that didn't quite make the cut, sometimes for obvious reasons.
Half a pound of grease paint on your face, that's their life. Let's face it, chums, all the rest are a gang of bums. So half a pound of grease paint on your face, get your togs and get it quick. Everybody sing, the Commonwealth! Yeah! Yeah, Commonwealth! Yeah!
But I just love how the Beatles approached the songwriting, at least in this era of their work, seemed to be that they would just sort of roll up in the studio and jam around, muck around, and occasionally stumble upon ideas. And the other band members would be there waiting to jump in and join into the song, and the songs just naturally occurred. Now, something that's infamous in the Beatles legend is the role of Yoko Ono in the Beatles splitting up. And the classic idea is that Yoko Ono was too invasive on the recording sessions and she sort of was a wedge in the Beatles. And what we see from this documentary is that Yoko Ono was certainly there. She was basically next to John Lennon 24 hours a day. But she wasn't really getting in the way. She barely said a word throughout the entire documentary. And you can get a sense of the Beatles just being quite accepting of her. I think there are times when they think it's a little bit odd that she's there all the time. But generally, I don't think she's getting in the way. But what is slightly painful is when Yoko does her signature singing, which it's recently actually become a bit of a meme on the internet that Yoko Ono does this sort of scream singing. And it turns out she was doing that back in the day. There's a couple opportunities during the recording sessions where she gets an opportunity to get on the mic because they're just sort of jamming around. And all I can say is that my cat, who was in the room, was not a fan of Yoko Ono. Another really sweet moment is where we saw Heather McCartney, who is Linda McCartney's daughter. She's not actually Paul McCartney's daughter. I think Linda had Heather with a previous partner and then Paul sort of adopted Heather. But it's just really sweet to see Heather there interacting with the Beatles, particularly with Ringo.
There will be an answer, let it be, yeah.
A moment that really made me laugh, actually, is when they've bought a music stand because they've decided they're going to do the concert on the roof and they need a music stand for it. And you'd think the Beatles, being the biggest band in the world, would be given decent music stands. But, of course, they're given that really crappy music stand that every musician knows and hates. And you just see the scene of Ringo doing the same thing that every musician has done, where he's broken that stand the first time he gets it out of the box because he's just unfolded it the wrong way. I just thought it was really funny.
Such a mean old man. Such a dirty old man.
Below, Ren will plant an extra 10 trees. Another thing that I was aware of before watching this, but it was amazing to see it happen on the screen, is the role of Billy Preston in the album Let It Be. Billy Preston is a keyboard player, and I'd heard before that the Beatles had been struggling to get the songs to sound how they wanted, and then Billy Preston sort of got involved and it suddenly came together. And we can literally see that on the screen. The Beatles, because they're trying to do a live album with no overdubs, they're feeling the lack of a keyboard player, because if one of them gets on the keyboards, then someone else has to then fill in on bass or fill in on guitar, and they feel the need for a fifth player. And then through what apparently is coincidence, Billy Preston comes down to the studio to hang out, and they decide to jam with him on some of the tracks, and he suddenly adds these, what are to us legendary keyboard lines that we have heard 1,000 times. And you can just see the room light up. You can see the Beatles suddenly come together as a unit. So Billy Preston really was, on this album, the fifth Beatle.
You're in the group.
Now, I've done a video before about the Beatles and their relationship with music theory. So how much music theory did the Beatles use when they were writing their music? And there was actually quite an interesting moment in this documentary to do with that, where George Harrison was playing Old Brown Shoe, and that was one that he played on the piano, which isn't his first instrument. So he wasn't completely sure what chords he was playing. And there's this moment where he asks Billy Preston what this chord is, E major with a C on top, which is an E augmented. And another moment where he asks him what an F chord is when the F has been raised up to an F sharp, which is an F sharp diminished. And it's really interesting just to hear how the Beatles sort of were just on the cusp of understanding these chords, but didn't really have that knowledge.
What's this chord then, Billy? It's F, but raising the F to F sharp.
Diminished.
And then F with that, like the seventh. It's great on piano because I don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
But it's great because I wouldn't have been able to do that on the guitar.
There was lots of moments in this documentary where we saw Beatles songs getting developed, but they hadn't been finished yet. And one of the most interesting moments, I thought, was The Long and Winding Road, which is quite notorious in Beatles history because its arrangement and recording was quite contentious, where they couldn't get the sound they wanted, and they weren't very happy with the Glyn Johns mix, who was the original producer. And then it was sent to Phil Spector, and he slapped these quite cheesy strings on it, which is the version that most people know. And the Beatles also weren't particularly happy with that. And what's really interesting is there's a scene where they're in the control room, they're listening back to the take of Long and Winding Road, which is actually the take, I think, which we hear on Let It Be. But in its current form, it hasn't been mixed, it hasn't got any backing on it. And they're talking about how they can improve it. And Glyn Johns is talking about whether they can save it in the mix. And George Harrison and George Martin are asking Paul whether he wants strings on it. And of course, Phil Spector did add strings to it, and that was something that Paul didn't like. So it's just interesting seeing this moment where they're discussing these things that went on to be quite contentious.
When it's mixed as it is, I'm sure with a mix on it would be all right. I know what the point.
Yeah, but we were just feeling that we could tidy it up before we did the one to remake.
Well, Paul, Paul's singing every strings anyway.
Paul, are you gonna have strings? Dunno.
The documentary closes with a basically unabridged cut of the rooftop performance, the famous final performance of the Beatles. on the top of their Apple Corps building. And first of all, what I thought was quite interesting is that they actually, because they were performing primarily as a way of recording, because they were recording what they were doing on the roof, and some of that actually made it onto the Let It Be album. So because they're recording, they actually did a few multiple takes of the same song, which I never knew before. I thought they treated it more like a live gig where you would play each song once. But the other thing I thought was really interesting is how we could see in real time how the police officers were trying to shut it down, because it did this clever thing where we were shown multiple camera angles and we could see what was happening downstairs. And there's just these wonderfully miserable police officers. I just couldn't imagine being those police officers. And the thing is, at the time, when the police officers first came down to the scene, they didn't realise the Beatles were on the roof, because the roof is really high. You can't see the Beatles from the street. So they thought the sound was kind of leaking out from the studio onto the street, and they didn't really know what was going on. So there's all this confusion where they're trying to shut down the Beatles, and everyone's sort of stalling and trying to sort of stop them. I think the biggest takeaway I had from watching this is the creative process, seeing the creative process behind these legendary songs. Because it's amazing how at the beginning of the documentary, the Beatles turn up and more or less they haven't really got any songs yet. They've got a few ideas. And over the course of the documentary, we see the songs come together. And when the songs when they're first jamming the songs, they really don't actually sound very good. They sound really rough and quite, I can imagine it would have been tempting to scrap these songs, which of course would have been awful because they went on to become hits, classic hits. So it's just a real masterclass in creativity and how you should stick with things and develop them and workshop them. It's just amazing to see a time where these songs hadn't actually come to be yet, and watching that process happen. So I, for one, came away thinking, man, I want to go make some music. So if you haven't seen this documentary, then definitely go check it out in full. It's 100% worth it. And it will make you fall back in love with the Beatles, particularly the Let It Be era. And as always, a massive, massive thanks goes to everyone who supports me on Patreon, including the names you see on screen right now, and Andre Sainz Diaja, Andy Deacon, Andrew Sussman, Austin Barrett, Austin Russell, Bob McKinstry, Boo Medell, Whitney Parker, Cameron Orvilla, Colin Aiken, Chris Cabell, Christopher Ryan, David Bennett is Hart, David Rivers, Donald Howard, Dr. Darren Wicks, Elena Skorchenko, Eugene Leroy, FD Hodor, Greg Kabowski, Ilamola Toner, Hamish Brocklebank, Hernick Kutcher, Hugo Miller, Ivan Pang, Jake Fisher, J.A. Kokensparger, John Dye, Josh Sanderlin, Justin Vigor, Mark Sotera, Mark Ziegenhagen, Max O'Keefe, Melody Composer Squared, Melanie Schonert, Michael Vivian, Nathan Lawrence, Nathaniel Park, Nick Chang, Paul Middleton, Paul Muller, Paul Hazel, Peter Dunphy, Richard Bride, Roger Clay, Sadia Carone, John Kennedy, Steve Daly, Stephen Lazaro, Tim Beaker, Trisha Adams, Tim Payne, Victor Levy, Vidad Flowers, Vladimir Kodakov, Volti, the Washington Shakespearean Festival, Waylon Fairbanks, and Zaphod.